They said out on the high Montana plains that silence could roar louder than any shout. You only understood what that meant when you met the Harpers. The spring of bitter winter finally loosened its grip. Gideon Harper, a man broad as a barn door and quiet as a sermon, had been left alone with 3 small people after Miriam Harper's coffin had disappeared into frozen ground the year before. The town took bets on how long he would manage. The Ladies' Aid Society took notes. Gideon was 6'4" in a jacket that always seemed 2 sizes too small, hands turned by rope and cattle, a face carved by sun and grief. He had never been an orator. Words had always sat on the wrong side of his teeth, heavy and reluctant. After Miriam's death, they shut up entirely. The silence sat in the house like dust and filled everything it touched with a gray weight. Breakfast, if Gideon managed to produce anything edible, was evidence of the slow erosion of order. That morning, a skillet hissed atop the cast-iron stove, while a blackened blur clung stubbornly to the pan. Maisie, 7 and fiendishly hopeful about eggs, wrinkled her nose and asked for something better. Silas, 9 and straight-backed with the flair of a boy who would measure cattle futures in his head, said nothing but pushed his plate away. Nora, 11, sat by the window. Her face was framed with the same dark curls Miriam had worn and the same hard gray eyes, but those eyes no longer danced. They watched. She hadn't spoken since the funeral. The sheriff's temper could have been softer than Gideon's grief. He tried a demand, a brittle version of a father's command, but the words fell flat. The house was a ledger of missed duties. The barn door hung crooked. The garden was a tangle, laundry piled like sad little monuments. Gideon's chest ached with the realization every parent knows. The task is never done, and sometimes it feels like you are losing the ledger altogether. Bitter Creek was small on purpose. It had one main street with a general store that smelled of molasses and feed and town gossip, a church whose bell carried for miles, a schoolhouse with a stove that did not always light, and a saloon where the chairs had seen better wars than a man's heart. 53 souls, if you counted the dogs, and everyone knew the size and shape of everyone else's grief. Gideon went to Mr. Boyd's store that afternoon for staples, flour, coffee, lamp oil, a handful of things that meant the difference between surviving and surrender. He found instead 3 women in their Sunday silks, a conspiratorial rustle of organza and needles. Mrs. Pembroke, suave and decisive as a tax collector, Mrs. Ellery, sweet-smelling and unrelenting, and Mrs. Hargrove, whose voice was a wind that could strip shingles. They had been watching Gideon's household for months from the vantage point of propriety. "Mr. Harper," Mrs. Pembroke began, with the smile that had undone many a man's day, "we are concerned. 3 children, a widower alone, none of us think it proper. The doctor says the eldest has simply stopped speaking. That sort of thing can be healed with a woman's hand. It's not cruel to say so." The words were a bruise. Gideon knew their language well. Concern, code for warning. An investigation would follow, a petition to Judge Merritt, and the town's kindest intentions could carry a child away to a place where linens were starched and love, official but soulless. Gideon tried the reply he kept like a pistol under his ribs, honest, short. "I'm doing my best." The words failed him, sliding off his tongue like apples off a frosted board. Mrs. Ellery tilted her chin. "Your best isn't enough." Mrs. Hargrove's eyes were already calculating the forms. When he stepped out into the dusty street, a hand fell on his shoulder. Nathan Whitfield, lean, neat, the kind of man who could look like a book you'd want to read, appeared from behind a stack of feed sacks. Nathan had been Gideon's friend before the war, and he had the look of a man who had also watched grief rearrange a life. "You heard?" Nathan asked. "How could I not? They make a music of it." Nathan's suggestion came like medicine disguised as mischief. "My sister's teaching in Boston, Clara Whitfield. She's not been well. She had to leave after that scandal last winter. She'd take a fresh start. What if she came out here and posed as your wife? Not forever, until harvest. You'll look respectable. They'll back off. The children get care. Clara gets a place to breathe." The idea was a strange patchwork of ethics and survival, to pretend, to bend the truth around a stitch of necessity. Gideon laughed once, a short, hard sound. The notion of a city teacher pretending to be his wife was so absurd it should have been stupid, but the town was sharpening its knives. His children were too small to be taken. Desperation is a teacher more effective than pride. He allowed Nathan to send the telegram. The stagecoach brought Clara Whitfield 2 weeks later. She fell off the coach like a woman coming to terms with a country that stretched longer than her learned definitions of civility. She was trim and precise, glass-rimmed spectacles sitting on a face built for lecture halls, a dress buttoned to the throat, and a suitcase smelling faintly of lavender and exile. Gideon knew the letter had been enough. Clara had read the plea, and yet the woman who looked at him then seemed to be measuring the man he had become, tall and weathered, honest to the bone, not sleek or soft or fit for Boston parlors. "This is Gideon Harper," Nathan said, stepping forward. "Welcome to Bitter Creek." Clara's eyes went wide, then narrowed twice in the teacher's appraisal. She extended a cool, steady hand. "Mr. Harper, my brother explained the circumstances. I need to see the house, the children, the tasks. This will be a professional arrangement. I will teach the children, keep the household, and I expect my privacy. Understood?" Gideon's throat made a sound like re-rolling a wick. He promised, and they rode back to the ranch like a story bound for the cover of a novel. The Boston spinster, the quiet giant, the tinny rattle of a carriage over prairie stones. The house was worse close up. Paint peeling, a porch that had drooped from lack of right angles, laundry left like soft gray sacrifices, a garden reduced to a tangle where Miriam's flowers once insisted on being beautiful. Clara took in the mess, the children, and then the youngest detail, Nora's hands, delicate and unclenched, the way her eyes were observing, rather than participating. "She's not mute," Gideon said, as if to defend some invisible license. "Dr. Halsey says there's nothing wrong with her ears. She just stopped." "Grief can do that," Clara said softly, "and it can be undone sometimes, with structure and trust. I will teach them. I will cook. But I will not be a mother by mistake. I will be a teacher and professional housekeeper. The town will see me as your wife, so they will leave you be. That is all." It was a lie dressed in good intention. They arranged the story the way one arranges flowers, modest, believable. The town would be satisfied with a neat pairing. Boston woman finds frontier redemption. Widower gets rescue. Children gain nurture. The Ladies' Aid would relent. Most people wanted to believe simple, tidy narratives. Clara stepped into the house that evening and did what teachers do. She organized chaos. She scrubbed a skillet until it shone, coaxed coffee into something that was not punishment, found eggs tucked under hay, and set a table the way women teach lessons by example. When the children hesitated at the sight of a breakfast that smelled of care, Nora appeared at the corner of the doorway with the ghost of a smile. Maisie asked if pancakes were real, and then announced, when they were, that she would teach her brothers to make them later. Silas eyed the teacher as if she were an alternate currency, useful, possibly exploitable. From morning, the house changed. Clara moved through the rooms with the unsentimental fervor of someone who believes routine is a muscle to be exercised. She set a schedule, lessons from 8 till noon, chores in the afternoons, and lessons always beginning with a short prayer, something to anchor them back to a rhythm Miriam had once called their own. She asked Gideon to tell stories of Miriam while they worked, not to make himself vulnerable, but to supply the facts that Nora had been clutching like seeds. The children began hesitantly to respond. Maisie learned the alphabet like one who devours the shape of things. Silas began to tally feed rations with a precision that made Gideon's jaw relax. Nora's slate was a small world. She wrote beautifully, letter after careful letter. She read. She finished a book in 3 days and wrote to Clara about it, a letter that resembled a poem and made Clara cry in the pantry, the way a woman in a kitchen will cry when she finally knows the shape of something broken. Rumor did what rumor does. It stretched and shrank until everyone agreed upon an improved Harper household. Mrs. Pembroke took Clara's presence as a kind of atonement for the town. Mrs. Ellery praised the children's cleanliness at the social. Even Mrs. Hargrove softened to the idea of a Boston pie entering the fall fair. But both pity and curiosity have teeth, and the fragile piece held only as long as no one asked for a receipt. Under Clara's teaching, the house did more than survive. It learned new verbs. Maisie learned to braid hair and measure dough. Silas learned to balance the cattle ledger in humility. Nora, who hadn't spoken since Miriam's burial, began to hum. The first sound was a skerrick of melody at the sink while she washed a dish. It was small and wrong and utterly perfect. Clara noticed and did not push. She offered choice and trusted that children, like seeds, are coaxed rather than commanded. There were bright accidents. The first time Clara tried milking Buttercup, the old milk cow that had been Gideon's pride and trouble, she discovered that city women can be awkward with udders. Buttercup retaliated with a sideways blast of milk, and the entire barn laughed. Everyone but Nora, who watched. Gideon laughed loudest of all. The sound was new air in his chest. It cracked something open. Laughter, once in a while, can repair what silence has broken. But bargains have a way of reaching their due. A letter arrived in late August with a Boston postmark, addressed with crisped ink. Hartwell Academy wrote to offer Clara a position. Steady salary, prestige, a return to the life she thought she had lost. The paper slipped out of her hands like a weathered map. It offered her an old course and a new fate. The offer arrived like a horn. She had 2 weeks before the academy required her presence. Nora found the letter folded under Clara's teaching notes and sat on the porch steps with all the quiet of a summer dusk. She wrote on her slate, "You will leave." Clara's throat tightened. She had not counted the cost of staying. She had thought of herself as someone passing through, arriving to shore up a house until the town's attention moved on. She had not imagined her chest could hold a family, or that a small girl's sudden voice could become an argument in itself. The night Nora broke, she did so with everything a child can throw into a wound. She crashed her slate against the wall, and the sound of it cracked the air. The scream that followed was not language, but an entire library of grief, raw, ancient, and incandescent. Clara ran to the bedroom, to the bed wrapped in Miriam's quilt, to the small body shaking with the force of months of silence unloosed. Nora's whisper at last was a word. "Don't." The syllable landed like a stone thrown into a well and sent ripples through Clara's sense of proper consequence. Gideon found Clara at the barn after midnight, hand on the loft beam as if to steady herself against the height of the sky. She told him of the letter. He said very little at first. Then, with the slow gravity of a man who had learned that some debts cannot be paid alone, he said, "Stay." Not as duty, he corrected softly, not as convenience. "Stay because the house is whole with you, because the children, because I am different with you." Clara's laugh was a little wild then. "That's hardly professional," she said. Gideon smiled like a man who had learned to borrow laughter from a stranger when he needed it. The town bristled at first. People are kin to gossip, and gossip is the breath of small places. But the Harper house had something more durable than rumor. It had work. The garden came back from the edge because Nora remembered where Miriam had planted thyme and rosemary, carrots in the far bed, tomatoes on stakes along the sun wall. Nora wrote the instructions in her neat hand. "Thyme here, basil here, Mama said this." Clara planted each seed like a benediction. The children learned to cook from their new mother teacher until Gideon could be trusted not to burn the coffee. The barn got painted, the fence re-tied, the mailbox mended. Quiet labor yields visible miracles. The fall fair was the town's referendum on character. Clara entered a lemon tart, a recipe passed down from her own mother, and people leaned forward to taste the evidence of her life. For a time, Mrs. Hargrove tried to pin a theft accusation on the recipe, but Maisie, with the undaunted honesty of 7, declared it her favorite and told the hall that Clara had taught her to braid and bake and not be afraid. The tart took first, and for once, the ladies' aid clapped because they meant it. When winter came with an early frost and the kind of air that made cheeks pinched roses, the Harpers had repaired what was needed. They were not fixed, not by a long shot. No one is. But the parts that belonged to being family were repairing themselves. Nora's voice had become a thing that could be relied upon. She wrote poetry that read like small rivers. Silas could name the cuts his father would make on a steer without blinking. Maisie sang the sort of nonsense songs that hold a house together. Gideon laughed at Clara in the barn without thinking about it. Clara watched the children and found herself thinking in a voice she had not intended to have again. She had come west to take a job, and she had stayed to become a town's favorite scandal turned salvation. There are no neat endings in real lives, only seasons. On a bright October morning, Gideon and Clara were married quietly in the little white church, Reverend Pritchard grinning like a man who had been waiting years to officiate a proper redemption. The congregation spilled out of the pews to applaud a timing that seemed, to everyone in town, perfect. Maisie threw wildflower petals like confetti. Silas wore a grin so broad it looked like he had stolen something. Nora handed Clara a small slip of paper, a story she had written about a garden that holds the dead and the living together, each becoming nourishment for the other. A subscription invitation is a small, modern thing, but in a town where mail comes by stage and news by mouth, the Harpers found small ways to gather. Clara arranged story nights and reading circles at the schoolhouse. The town children came, the older folk came, Mrs. Pembroke came and sat with her arms folded and pretended she did not love the way Nora read aloud. "If you like this tale and want more," Clara would say, because teachers are notoriously practical, tell Mr. Boyd to set aside a copy of the next collection for you. Come to the schoolhouse on Thursday nights. Bring a pie if you can. It was, in its way, a subscription. Come back and be part of the story. If you like this retelling, there are gentle ways to keep receiving them. Subscribe to the author's updates via the chat subscription option, or press the subscribe button, where you see it to get new stories, monthly notes, and behind-the-scenes glimpses of how characters like Clara and Gideon come to be. Tell a friend who loves slow recoveries and prairie nights. Share the story here. Your return is the only currency small towns like Bitter Creek value more than flour and lamp oil, attendance,